In Narratives of Investigation, we've examined a variety of different forms of investigations in several different media, ranging from straightforward detective fiction to whatever Mystery House is. We also explored a lot of different definitions of what an investigation is, whether it's detective fiction or a database or puzzle video games. Many conflicting arguments have been made about the genre. And starting with detective fiction, we synthesized our own fair play rules based on the common ground of a bunch of old lists. While some of these made sense, number 3, there must be one detective. Some of them were quite weird. Seriously, were twins that heavily used? Needless to say, I had problems with using this to determine good or valid mysteries. After all, these are very specifically the Sherlockian type of stories, and investigation media has long moved past that. After seeing the futility of looking at Obra Dinn through this lens, I knew it had to go. But, like all you Chicago students, I had to be categorizing everything I consumed, especially in my classes. How else would I know what to think about our readings and playings and watchings? Of course, as a game designer, or should I say media arts and design major with a focus in the games cluster, I wanted to focus on those. So I turned to the most advanced games discourse categorization tool we know, the alignment chart. Well, not a classic good neutral evil one, but rather an arrangement of purity of narrative and mechanics. The strictest interpretation of the mechanics of an investigative game necessitates the player to be the one understanding and solving the mystery with no help. In doing so, they embody fair play, in which their wits are directly pitted against the difficulty of the puzzle of the case. Under this paradigm, the player receives little help. They must understand the details of what has occurred. In the next column, a more generous interpretation of the mechanics of an investigative game. The mechanics are once again modeling the process of investigation, but may allow progression without understanding on the player's part. This gives the player an unfair advantage in the fair play paradigm because they don't really have to understand everything they do. Finally, in the last column, anything goes. There are no mechanical requirements for a game to be considered investigative. Now, this may sound silly, but remember, there's a whole nother category. Here, we examine the narrative of the game. Similarly, we begin with a strict definition. In our canon, that requires a detective who investigates and solves a mystery. Sherlock Holmes, boom. William of Baskerville, bam. As a side note, yes, I know these are like the same person, and I know that William of Baskerville is a priest, not a detective, but, we had that whole conversation about the historicization of Sherlock Holmes as a detective, and anyways, I think he counts. The logical next column in our investigative game is the removal of the sole detective and keeping the mysteries. Detectives are so last century. Priests are even older. Dinner parties are the new chic. Hold on, I'm getting reports that those are also last century, damn it. Well, anyways, we're keeping the mystery, and anyone and everyone can be solving these. And last but not least, we've got the narrative rebel. An investigative game can have any sort of story. These rebel categories may seem stupid, especially when combined together, but they're valuable for crossing with the other categories. So there we have it, the framework of our chart. Now, we just have to fill it. The hard work begins. Starting with the upper left, a game that requires narrative and mechanical purity. It needs to have a detective, it needs a mystery, and the player must understand what's happening. To me, that singles out one game we've played, Return of the Obra Dinn. You're an investigator solving the mystery of the return of the Obra Dinn, necessitating the investigation and solution of all 60 fates. It's got no hint system, and fates are confirmed in groups of 3, minimizing the amount of guessing and checking you can do. To me, this is a slam dunk. Everything lines up very well, and Obra Dinn comfortably sits in the seat, and frankly deserves it. To its right, a game that requires a detective mystery. However, it's not mechanically demanding of a detective. I'm putting Orwell, Keeping an Eye on You, in this category. While there are a variety of these database games, Orwell heavily guides you in identifying whether information is conflicting and problematic or not. You'll also receive feedback from a character ingrained within the police unit that serves as a more implicit guidance. Due to these mechanics, the player doesn't need to understand all of the decisions that they make and receive explicit and implicit feedback as they progress. I don't adore this placement, mostly because I didn't finish Orwell, but I think it works here based on what I saw. Finally, a narratively pure but mechanically agnostic experience. Well, to no surprise, this goes to Sherlock Holmes himself. A Case of Identity has no mechanics, as it's a short story. It meets the narrative requirements. And yes, while this is a book, and not a game per se, the ways in which these works are engaged with are specifically in a proto-game way. This is best exemplified by the aforementioned fair play rules that we've looked at, such as Van Dyne's rule number 3, there must be no love interest. The business in hand is to bring a criminal to the bar of justice, not to bring a lovelorn couple to the hymeneal altar, Van Dyne says, which, ew, also indicates an eschewment of traditional tropes and fictional stories in exchange for cold, hard justice. Van Dyne also emphasizes that the reader must know who his co-deductor is, comparing it to a relay race, which places the act of reading these into games territory. That being said, there are not identifiable mechanics, so while it can be considered a game, it gets to live in this black void of a characterization. Next row. We've got in mechanical purist and narrative neutral Case of the Golden Idol. There's no detective present, however the entire game is a mystery, specifically the Case of the Golden Idol. While this framing suggests an investigator of sorts, there's never one that is revealed explicitly. Unlike Oberdin, this game does have a hint system. However, it's not one that is obtrusive and has a similarly unobtrusive verification system, informing the player if their answers are correct, off by 2 or fewer, or just wrong, meaning 3 or more incorrect parts. While this is certainly more generous than Oberdin, it by no means ends up in the category of mechanical neutrality. Now, for the middlemost category, narrative and mechanical neutral, I think this is the most difficult one to place. And my conclusion here is the least satisfactory. I put Mystery House in this slot. It's got a narrative mystery, the house in question. And while it has intensely confusing mechanics that have some investigation, you have to find and use items. It by no means requires you to understand what the heck is going on. In fact, the obtuse text parsing and specific commands reduces your ability to understand what's really happening in addition to the outdated graphics. In this way, Mystery House could be put into a different category had it been realized differently or at a later date, but for now it lives in the center of our alignment chart. Hopefully that's the last we see of this terrible, terrible game. And the mechanical rebel to round up our narrative neutral row is the film Searching. Once again, while not technically a game, Searching invites a gamification through what's not quite voyeurism, but a more active audience perspective. As opposed to a traditionally shot film, Searching utilizes the medium of a computer screen and television broadcast to tell its story, which directly demands audience familiarity with these mediums. And a contrast between that familiarity and what's being shown makes us as viewers think about how we would do this differently. Searching also hides clues and references in various places that are not diegetically related to the story, like the high school mascot being a catfish, that allow it to play a game, revealing secrets to the viewer. While watching this film, I wondered what this process would be like for me, or what I would do if this happened to a friend. This process of primary identification extends even to many of the shots within the film that are in first person, or that what we, the viewer, are seeing is what the dad is seeing and searching on his screen. So I acknowledge that searching is a little weird, but this column's all about being expansive, alright? First up, with the most mechanical purity, is a hand with many fingers. It earns its mechanical purity in having no assistive mechanics, meaning every connection made is one you create by intent. New info is gated behind making those correct connections, and due to the void of narrative caused by its database and archival format, there's not an explicit investigation occurring, even though the actions taken are clearly the act of investigating. Next up, narrative rebel, mechanical neutral. Secret Hitler slots in here for me. The narrative arc is not one of an investigation, and while sniffing out Hitler is important, it's not always a win condition. Secret Hitler asks its players to make decisions based on limited information, which may seem like it would be deductive. However, I place it in this category due to the aspect of team play. Team play in Secret Hitler often causes 3 decidedly non-investigative scenarios. First, that you can be completely wrong in your deductions and guesses and still win because of your team. Second, that you can be completely right in your deductions and still lose because of your team. Finally, if you're playing as a fascist, you know all of the secrets. You know who the fascists are and who the liberals are. This removes all of the investigation from the game, except for maybe finding out who Hitler is. But no, you already know that too. This undermines the value of the decisions you make, instead favoring your talking skills. While Secret Hitler does that blend incredibly well, it still muddles the investigative skills that you could be using. This brings us to the very last corner, which represents the 99% of games not found anywhere else on this chart. I'm going to pick one at random. I like Uno. We're going with that. And there you have it. The whole chart. We're done. But wait. Categorization is supposed to tell us something. Any good UChicago student will tell you that. I made up these categories, so I guess that falls to me. Clearly, all of these games and these categories aren't equivalent. I mean, Uno's here. Which of these are games of investigation? Or at least, which of these games of investigation are good? And looking at these games, I think Mystery House, Searching, Secret Hitler, and Uno should not be called games of investigation. Let's look into these. Mystery House is too a mystery house. I think this is kind of what I was saying before. It is too old. It doesn't do anything. It's really confusing. I don't think there's really much logical investigation or even, social investigation. It's just an old game that is really, really, really outdated. Searching, while feeling like a game, doesn't feel like a good one. The plotlines feel nonsensical at points, and while entertaining to watch, it doesn't feel fun, and certainly this film is not fair. Secret Hitler is more about reading the vibes of others than analyzing the info given, with most games relying on that social deduction to be resolved. I don't think I need to explain Uno getting the boot. Now, when we remove these, this leaves a really fascinating remaining series of games. All of these have either mechanical or narrative purity. This suggests that we can draw a more systematic conclusion from this. A game either needs to have a detective in it, or the player needs to be the detective. Someone's got to be doing the solving, and they have to be playing fair. Now, of course, there's a lot of flaws with this approach. I'm drawing a wider conclusion from a small handful of works that isn't even the half of what we consumed for this class, let alone in the entirety of the genre. What started as a shitpost in my mind may have actually borne some really valuable fruit. Thank you for watching.